So the devotees invited me for one of these darshans. And at one of the darshans, I asked Prabhupada, it was Gargamuni had requested Prabhupada to sing the Chintamani prayers, which Prabhupada had done very beautifully. And afterwards, he asked if anyone had any questions, so I raised my hand. And at the time, the draft board was, a problem for every one of us at that age. So I was very concerned about whether or not I'd be drafted because America was at war in Vietnam. And so I asked Prabhupada to describe what the spiritual world was like. And he said to me, he looked back and he looked at me and he said, in the spiritual world, he said, the spiritual world is a place where there are no draft boards. Then he told a story. He said there was once a Christian minister who was preaching in England to coal miners. And he was describing the hell that awaited someone if they didn't accept the shelter of Jesus. And he said that hell is a terrible place, very, very dark, very dank and cold and wet. He said no one would want to go there. So all the coal miners were thinking, well, if that's hell, where are we? We're already in hell. It doesn't sound very fearful for us. This is where we live now. We're coal miners. So then the minister was trying to think of a way to convince them to begin worshiping Jesus. So then finally he said, in hell, there are no newspapers and there's no tea. And then they all said, oh, then we must worship Jesus. So Prabhupada said, so in the spiritual world, there are no draft boards. He said, is that all right? I said, yes. Everybody said, Jai.
Well, the first time I met Prabhupada, I was living in Hawaii. And I was a hippie, and I was living out on the beach, meditating, reading the Bhagavad Gita, trying to understand the meaning of life. And as I was sitting there one day, meditating, a flyer flew by, and it said A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami speaking at Sunset Point on the Bhagavad Gita. So I thought, this is amazing. I can hear an actual Indian Swami talk to me about the Bhagavad Gita, the book I'd been studying for like 2 years. And since I was 14, I was 16 at the time. And so I went there to the lecture, and Prabhupada sat there and he was talking, and he was sitting on just a slightly raised platform covered with a beautiful Indian rug. And there was only like maybe 5 or 6 devotees. I mean, it was very, very small. This was in 1969. And he finished talking and asked for questions. And I said, Swamiji, I've been reading the Bhagavad Gita, and I handed him mine. And I said, is this one okay? Because a lot of the content of the lecture was how you must read a bona fide Bhagavad Gita from a bona fide spiritual master, etc. So I handed him my book, and I said, is this one okay? And he said, well, come back to the temple and we'll talk. So I got in the back of this truck, and I remember sitting in the back of the truck. It was an open flatbed type truck with a couple of other people and devotees, and he was sitting in the front with a couple of other people. And I was watching his head the whole time because it was bobbing, and it was this beautiful bald head. And as we walked up the stairs to the temple, he said, come on in and we'll talk. So I went into the room, and he started talking to me about the Bhagavad Gita. And I started talking to him about LSD, which I was very much into at the time, and how I had seen Krishna on LSD. And he said, well, you don't need to take LSD because you can see Krishna because Krishna loves you and shows favor upon you. And then Govindadasi was there at the time, and she brought in a tray of sugar cane. Prabhupada said, would you share the sugar cane with me? And at the time I said, no, I don't eat sugar, because I was against any kind of sugar eating. And he said, this is very natural. It just grows on the side of the road, it's very natural. He was reading my mind. He knew exactly where I was coming from. And he showed me how to eat it. So we sat there and we ate sugar cane together, and I was chewing the pieces and he was chewing the pieces. We were putting our chewed pieces onto the same plate. I mean, in retrospect, it's amazing because it was this amazingly casual thing. And he played me a tape of a CD, not a CD, of a record that he had done, and showed me some other books and said, "I'd like you to stay here at the temple." And at the time I said, "Well, but he told me I would have to stop taking LSD." So I said, "I can't do that." I said, "I'm getting so much spiritual insight from taking LSD." So he said, "Well, I hope that you will reconsider." And that was the first time I met him. It was pretty wonderful. I went back to the forest to meditate some more. And very shortly after that, I had the realization that the only way I could ever get spiritual enlightenment was to find him. So I called around, because I didn't even know there was a Hare Krishna movement. There was no connection. It was like this Swami. And I found out that he was in Los Angeles. So I went back to Los Angeles, and he was coming like in 2 weeks. And when I saw him there, I was dressed in a sari and everything. And he looked at me and he said, "I remember you from Hawaii." And he said he was very glad I had come. And said, "Come back to my apartment and we'll talk." So he had an apartment. This was when the temple in Los Angeles was not where it is now. It was on La Cienega, I think. And it was an old church. So I went back to his apartment and we talked, and he said to me, "Now you understand the difference between your Bhagavad Gita and my Bhagavad Gita." It was very cute.
The Seattle temple was, Narayan was up there building an altar, and when it was built, right around that time, I remember Prabhupada gave a lecture one day in the evening, an evening class, and he mentioned a godbrother of his, he'd received a letter that a godbrother of his had just passed away. Don't remember, somebody else will know the name. It was one of the Tirtha Swamis in the Gaudiya Math, but it wasn't Bhakti Vilas Tirtha, who lived, of course, much beyond that. It was another one whose name was something Tirtha Maharaj. And Prabhupada said that this particular godbrother was very kind upon him and had actually written him a letter while he was living in Vrindavan as a Vanaprastha, or Jhansi or Vrindavan. I forget where he said he was, but he said he received a letter from this godbrother reminding him that Guru Maharaj, meaning Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, had wanted him to take sannyas and to preach, especially in the West. And this godbrother had written him a letter reminding him about that. And Prabhupada said, "I did not want to take sannyas because it is a very difficult position materially. It's not easy to do, and I didn't want to do it. But this godbrother wrote me this letter at this time," and he said, and at the same time, right in the same days when I received this letter, he said, 3 times in succession, on 3 successive nights, he said, my Guru Maharaj appeared before me in a dream. And each time in the dream, he was walking away from me, and as he was walking away, he turned around and beckoned for me to follow. And he went like this. Right? And he had that dream 3 times. I believe he said 3 nights in succession, but definitely 3 successive times in a very short span of time. Right at the same time that externally the godbrother had sent them this letter. And these things prompted him to take sannyas. What Prabhupada said specifically was, in this way, my Guru Maharaj pulled me out from this material world. And when he said pulled, 2 tears just literally suddenly formed and leaped out of his eyes and went then, and it was just like they were squeezed out by a shudder of ecstasy, and went running down his cheeks. They hadn't formed slowly and dripped down like most tears do. As he said pulled, his voice got real thick as he said it, and tears came shooting out of his eyes. And everybody in the room was just speechless, right? Because we were all devotees or guests but mostly it was just devotees there. It was an evening program and during a weekday. And I was very much impressed at the amount of intense feeling that he had toward his Guru Maharaj calling him to take sannyas.
One morning I shaved my head, and when Prabhupada, the first time he saw me, he came out of his apartment, and he looked at me and he saw my head shaved, and he said, "Ah, now you are an ideal brahmachari." He was very pleased that I had shaved my head, because he had noticed all along that I was keeping short hair, but I wouldn't shave up. And I had joined with Vishnu Jan, and he had shaved up before me, but I didn't shave up immediately. So when I finally shaved up, Prabhupada appreciated that. One time I asked Prabhupada on one of those morning walks, first walks I went with him, I asked him, how many pure devotees were there on the planet? And Srila Prabhupada turned to me or to one of the devotees and asked, how many devotees are there in ISKCON now? He said, that is how many pure devotees there are.